In 1938, she was the crown princess of the Third Reich, gifted a miniature palace and a masterpiece painting for her baptism, while 500 Luftwaffe jets roared overhead. But the fairy tale ended with a cyanide capsule and a world that wanted her name erased. For decades, Edda Göring lived in the shadows of a modest Munich flat, a silent witness to a fallen empire. Just before she died, the silence finally broke, revealing the reality of her life as history's most radioactive orphan. But the secrets she kept until her final breath prove that even in the wreckage of a nightmare, some loyalties never die. The fall of the House of Göring. Imagine waking up one morning as the most pampered child on the planet, only to realize by sunset that your last name is essentially a social death warrant. That was the whiplash reality for Edda Göring. To understand what they did to her, you first have to understand the height from which she fell. We aren't talking about a silver spoon lifestyle. We're talking about a solid gold, diamond-encrusted existence. As the daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, Edda grew up in Carenhall, a forest estate so massive and gaudy it made most royal palaces look like budget motels. She had her own miniature palace, a fleet of toys, and a father who, when he wasn't busy orchestrating the machinery of the Holocaust, treated her like a living icon of the perfect German future. Then, the clock struck midnight on the Third Reich. In 1945, the fantasy didn't just crumble, it was pulverized. As the Allied forces closed in, the Reich's first daughter was suddenly shoved into a car and whisked away from her forest playground. The transition was brutal. One day she's surrounded by stolen Renaissance masterpieces and servants, and the next, she's a fugitive in the Bavarian Alps. When the Americans finally caught up with the Görings, the princess treatment ended instantly. This is where the narrative usually cuts to her father's trial at Nuremberg. But for Edda, the real story was just beginning. At only 7 years old, she became a ward of the state, or more accurately, a problem the New World didn't know how to solve. The authorities stripped her of everything. They didn't just take the jewels and the art. They took the very foundations of her identity. Imagine being a kid and having the government come in to seize your toys because they were bought with blood money. It's a heavy concept for a child to grasp, but that was the start of the systematic stripping of her life. She was moved from the luxury of Carenhall to the cold, damp walls of an internment camp. This wasn't a school, it was a holding pen for the families of the high-ranking Nazis. The they in this story, the Allied occupiers and the post-war German administrators, were determined to ensure that no Göring would ever rise to power again. This meant total disenfranchisement. They put her and her mother, Emmy, into a tiny cottage in the Weldenstein forest, living in what can only be described as a state of monitored poverty. They were under constant surveillance, their mail was read, and their movements were restricted. The girl who had been gifted a painting worth millions for her baptism was now literally scouring the woods for firewood. This wasn't just about justice, it was about the total erasure of her father's legacy through the suffering of his kin. The world wanted her to feel the weight of every bomb her father dropped and every life he stole. For a young Edda, this felt less like denazification and more like a personal vendetta by a world that hated her father. She became a living ghost, a girl trapped between the memory of a doting dad and the reality of a monster. But the luxury didn't just vanish, it was hunted. The Reich's first daughter and the spoils of war. If you think your family's holiday arguments over who gets grandma's china are bad, try being Edda Göring. For her, the family heirlooms weren't dusty plates. They were world-class Renaissance masterpieces and jewels that could fund a small country. This part is where the story shifts from a sad tale of a fallen princess to a gritty, decades-long legal thriller. You see, Edda wasn't content to just live a quiet life of monitored poverty. She wanted her stuff back, and she was willing to fight the entire German government to get it. The centerpiece of this battle was a painting, The Madonna and Child, by Lucas Cranach the Elder. This wasn't just any painting. It was a 16th-century masterpiece that had been gifted to Edda by the city of Cologne for her baptism in 1938. Now, use your imagination here. Imagine you're the mayor of Cologne in 1938, and the second most powerful man in the country, who also happens to have a notorious shopping habit for art, just had a baby. You aren't just sending a Hallmark card. You're sending a masterpiece to stay on his good side. After the war, the city of Cologne essentially said, "Yeah, about that. We only gave that to her because we were terrified of her dad. We want it back." Edda, who actually went on to study law, wasn't having it. Her argument was fascinatingly bold. She claimed the painting was a personal gift to her, an innocent child, and therefore, it shouldn't be seized as part of her father's criminal assets. She spent 15 years locked in a legal cage match with the authorities. At one point, she actually won a round in 1954, forcing the state of Bavaria to return jewelry worth about 150,000 Deutschmarks. It was a massive middle finger to the denazification efforts of the time. She was living proof that the Göring name still had teeth in a courtroom. But the Madonna was the white whale. The case dragged on until 1968, reaching the Federal Court of Justice. The government's stance was clear. The gift was an act of corruption, part of a cult of personality that had no place in the New Germany. They argued that gifts given to the children of dictators under duress are not legally binding. When the court finally ruled against her for the last time, it wasn't just about a painting. It was a legal declaration that the era of Göring privilege was officially over. The relatable part of this, if you can call it that, is the sheer, stubborn loyalty she had. Most people in her position would have changed their name, dyed their hair, and moved to South America. Not Edda. She kept the Göring family crest on her wall. She kept portraits of her father in her Munich apartment. She viewed these legal battles as a way to keep her father's memory clean. In her mind, if the gifts were legal, then maybe the man who received them wasn't the monster the history books said he was. She was fighting for the art, sure, but she was really fighting for a version of her father that only she chose to believe in. This wasn't just about greed. For Edda, every piece of jewelry and every canvas was a tether to a childhood where she was loved and protected before the world turned into a place of ruins and recriminations. By the time the final gavel fell in '68, she had lost the fortune, but she had gained a reputation as the unrepentant daughter. She had become a woman who lived in a museum of a dead world, surrounded by the ghosts of things she no longer owned. She wasn't just fighting for art. She was fighting for her inheritance of ghosts, internment, and the cold reality of 1946. Time is where the glamour completely falls off the bone. We have to talk about sack-dilling. To the rest of the world, the year 1946 was about the Nuremberg trials, the grand theater of justice where the big fish, like Hermann Göring, finally had to answer for the unthinkable. But while Hermann was sitting in a cell wearing a simplified uniform without his medals, his 7-year-old daughter was experiencing a different kind of imprisonment. Imagine being 7. At that age, your world is usually defined by school, play, and a sense of security. Edda's world was defined by barbed wire and the smell of boiled cabbage. They, the Allied forces, didn't just arrest the perpetrators, they rounded up the families. Edda and her mother, Emmy, were taken to an internment camp in the Oberpfalz region. This wasn't a soft landing. This was a cold, hard slap from reality. The woman who used to be the First Lady of the Luftwaffe, famous for her sweeping silk gowns and theatrical parties, was now sharing a cramped space with other wives of the Reich, scrubbing floors and waiting in line for meager rations. The psychological shift here is hard to overstate. In the documentaries, we see the rubble of Berlin, but we rarely see the internal rubble of a child who has been told her hero father is actually the world's greatest villain. In the camp, Edda was no longer a princess. She was a liability. The guards weren't there to protect her. They were there to watch her. There's an almost cinematic cruelty to the timing. While Edda was playing in the dirt of a detention center, her father was just a few miles away in Nuremberg, fighting for his life and losing. What they did to her in 1946 was essentially a forced crash course in being a pariah. She was exposed to the re-education programs, shown the footage of the camps her father helped create, and told that her name was a curse. For a child, that kind of environmental pressure is essentially a form of psychological branding. But here's the kicker. Instead of breaking her, it seemed to fuse her even more tightly to her father. While the Allies hoped that showing these families the truth would make them repent, for Edda, it felt like a siege. She saw herself and her mother as victims of Victor's justice. Then came October 15th, 1946. This is the moment that redefined her life forever. Hermann Göring, ever the showman, cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule. The news hit the internment camp like a bomb. For the world, it was a final act of cowardice, or a last-minute escape. For Edda, it was the moment her God died and left her alone in a world that hated her. She wasn't allowed to mourn him like a normal daughter. There was no grand funeral, no headstone to visit. His body was cremated in the ovens of Dachau, the very place his regime had used for mass murder, and his ashes were scattered into a nameless stream. They left her with nothing. No body to bury, no money to live on, and a name that made people cross the street when they saw her coming. After their release from the camp, Edda and Emmy were relegated to a tiny 5-room cottage in the Weldenstein forest. It had no electricity, no running water. The girl who used to have a private train was now hauling water from a well. The cold reality was that the world wanted her to disappear. They wanted her to be so poor and so ashamed that she would eventually just fade into the background of history. But Edda Göring wasn't the fading type. She survived on the charity of former Nazis and old family friends who still viewed her father as a hero. This created a strange subterranean social circle. While the rest of Germany was trying to build a new democratic future, Edda was being raised in a pocket of the past, a tiny, dark bubble where her father was still a great man, and the current government was the enemy. This monitored poverty didn't make her a Democrat. It made her a martyr in her own mind. She learned to be quiet, she learned to be frugal, and she learned to keep her secrets locked behind a polite, medical clerk smile. The name Göring had gone from a skeleton key to a deadbolt. The post-war pariah, survival in Munich. By the time the 1950s rolled around, West Germany was trying desperately to move on. People were trading their uniforms for business suits, and the economic miracle was starting to turn rubble into high-rises. But for Edda Göring, moving on wasn't really an option. She was living in Munich, a city that had once been the capital of the movement, but was now a place that wanted to forget people like her ever existed. Think about the sheer awkwardness of her daily life. She eventually found work as a medical clerk, a stable, quiet, bureaucratic job. But imagine being the HR manager looking at her resume. Name: Edda Göring. Father's occupation: Reichsmarshal, deceased. It's not exactly a conversation starter. Throughout her adult life, she lived in a state of social house arrest. She wasn't behind bars anymore, but she was trapped by a reputation she couldn't outrun. Every time she applied for a new apartment or a bank account, that name triggered a red flag. They, the West German authorities and the local social circles, treated her like a ticking time bomb of bad PR. If she was seen enjoying herself too much, the tabloids would jump on her for living off hidden Nazi gold. If she looked too poor, it was a reminder of a past the government wanted to bury. Consequently, Edda became a master of the gray life. She lived in a modest apartment in the Lehel district, a place filled with heavy furniture and old-world vibes that felt like a time capsule of 1930s Berlin. To her neighbors, she was a polite, slightly reserved woman who kept to herself. But inside that apartment, it was a different world. While other children of the Reich took very different paths, Edda remained an outlier. Take Gudrun Himmler, for example, who became a literal activist for former SS members. Or look at the other side of the coin. Niklas Frank, the son of the Butcher of Poland, who famously spent his life touring Germany to tell anyone who would listen that his father was a monster. Edda rejected both extremes. She didn't become a neo-Nazi poster girl, but she absolutely refused to denounce her father. To her, the secret police and the final solution were things that happened in the news. In her home, Hermann Göring was just the man who called her his little sunbeam and brought her expensive dolls. This refusal to repent made her a permanent pariah. She was effectively blacklisted from polite society. You wouldn't find Edda Göring at the opera or at high society galas, even though she had the pedigree for it. She was relegated to a subculture of old Nazis, a dwindling circle of people who still referred to her as princess, and met in secret to reminisce about the good old days. This was her survival mechanism. In a world that looked at her with disgust, she sought out the few people who looked at her with reverence. The German government kept a discreet but firm eye on her. They weren't looking for a coup, they were looking for assets. For decades, there were rumors that the Görings had stashed millions in Swiss banks or buried loot in the Bavarian woods. Every few years, investigators would poke around her life, trying to see if she was secretly funded by some Odessa network. She wasn't. She was living on a modest salary, supplemented by the occasional sale of a family item that had slipped through the cracks of the 1946 seizures. The relatability of Edda's struggle lies in the universal question: are you responsible for your parents' sins? The world said yes. Every tax audit, every denied social invitation, and every cold stare in the grocery store was a reminder that she was paying a debt she didn't personally incur. She spent her life in a defensive crouch. She learned that to survive as a Göring in Munich, you had to be invisible. You had to be a ghost who worked 9 to 5, paid her taxes, and never, ever talked to the press. For over 50 years, she played that role to perfection, becoming the most famous woman in Germany that nobody actually knew. She wasn't a rebel. She was a curator. She spent her life guarding a version of history that the rest of the world had rightfully set on fire. She lived in the middle of a modern, democratic city, but mentally, she never really left the woods of Hall. While others chose to repent, Edda chose to remember. Final revelations. The 2018 interviews. For decades, the Princess of the Reich was a vault. Journalists from New York to Tokyo had tried to crack her, offering huge sums for a tell-all that would finally bridge the gap between the doting father and the genocidal war criminal. Edda turned them all down. She lived by a code of silence that was as much about self-preservation as it was about loyalty. But as she entered her late 70s and early 80s, the vault began to creak open. When she finally spoke in her final years before her death in December 2018, what she revealed wasn't a confession. It was something far more chilling and human. The revelation that stunned observers wasn't about hidden gold or secret documents. It was the fact that after 70 years of being confronted with the evidence of the Holocaust, Edda Göring hadn't changed her mind one bit. In her final interviews and documented conversations with those close to her, she revealed the reality of what they did to her. They had failed to denazify her soul. She admitted that she lived her entire life viewed as a political prisoner by the German state. She didn't see herself as the daughter of a monster. She saw herself as the victim of a world that refused to let her love her father. She spoke about the private Hermann Göring with a warmth that was deeply unsettling. To her, the man who ordered the looting of a continent was just Papa, the man who smelled of expensive tobacco and gave the best hugs. When asked about the atrocities, she would pivot with a practiced, almost informal shrug, claiming she didn't know about those things, or that they were exaggerated by the victors. This was her final revelation. The psychological armor of the child is impenetrable. The world had spent decades trying to force her to see the blood on her father's hands, but she revealed that she only ever saw the rings on them. She also finally opened up about the petty ways the post-war government continued to squeeze her. She felt that they, the German authorities, had kept her in a state of perpetual legal limbo to prevent her from ever truly feeling at home in her own country. She described the 2015 petition she filed with the Bavarian Landtag, where she made one last desperate attempt to get her father's expropriated assets returned. She didn't need the money. She was an old woman at that point. She revealed that she did it for the principle. She wanted the state to admit that they had treated her unfairly because of her name. The petition was, of course, rejected unanimously within minutes. Her final perspective was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. She revealed that she felt no shame. Think about that. In a modern Germany that has built its entire national identity on Vergangenheitsbewältigung, struggle to overcome the past, Edda Göring revealed that she lived in the heart of Munich without a shred of it. She didn't see the 1946 seizures as justice. She saw them as a theft of her childhood. She revealed that what they did to her after the war, the internment, the poverty, the social exclusion, only served to validate her father's worldview in her eyes. In her mind, the Allies weren't liberators. They were the people who broke her toys and killed her dad. This final revelation is riveting because it's so relatable to our modern understanding of bubbles. Edda lived in a social and psychological bubble that the truth could not pop. She revealed that her life was a long, quiet act of defiance. She didn't need to wear a swastika to be a Nazi. She just had to refuse to believe that her father was anything less than a hero. When she died in 2018, she took her secrets to a grave that, in a final act of government-mandated erasure, was kept secret to avoid becoming a pilgrimage site for the far right. The revelation wasn't a gotcha moment where she admitted her father was evil. The revelation was that the daughter of Hermann Göring lived for 80 years believing that the only thing her father did wrong was lose the war. She revealed that the punishment of being a Göring wasn't the poverty or the clerk job. It was the total, lifelong isolation of being the only person left who loved a man the rest of the world considered a demon. In the end, she remained the keeper of a very dark flame. The girl who never left. Karen Hall. When Edda Göring took her last breath in December 2018, the headlines didn't scream about the passing of a medical clerk or a Munich resident of 60 years. They spoke of the last Nazi princess. It's a heavy title to carry into a grave, but it was the only one she ever truly owned. After a long digging through the wreckage of her life, we're left with a haunting question. Did she ever actually leave that forest estate in 1945? Or did she just spend 70 years wandering the ruins of her own mind? What they did to Edda Göring after World War II was, by any objective standard, a total dismantling. They took her home, they took her fortune, they took her father, and eventually, they took the very ground he walked on by scattering his ashes into an anonymous river. In the eyes of the law and the victors, this was the necessary pruning of a poisonous family tree. But the human brain is a funny thing. Instead of the trauma making her turn away from the darkness, it made her burrow into it. The revelation of her final years is that the more the world tried to scrub the name Göring from the map, the more Edda used her own life to keep the ink fresh. Her legacy is a complicated, messy mirror for the rest of us. It's easy to look at her and see a villain, or at least a woman whose willful ignorance was its own kind of crime. It's harder to look at her and see a little girl who was simply never told no until the day the bombs started falling, and who spent the rest of her life trying to figure out why the good guys were the ones who made her mother cry. The informal truth of her life is that she was history's most high-profile case of arrested development. She was the girl who never left Karen Hall because Karen Hall was the only place where she was safe, where she was loved, and where her father wasn't a monster. The way the German state handled her death is perhaps the most telling part of this entire saga. Even in 2018, they were still afraid of her. They wouldn't release the location of her grave. There was no public service. She was buried in an unmarked spot in Munich's Waldfriedhof cemetery. They were terrified that even in death, the name Göring would act as a magnet for the very ideology they had spent decades trying to bury. They were still trying to manage her, even when she was no longer a person, but a pile of ashes. It was the final chapter in a lifelong effort to ensure that the Göring line ended in total, silent obscurity. But did it work? In a way, Edda won. She never gave them the satisfaction of a moment of clarity. She never gave the documentaries the weeping confession they craved. She lived her life exactly how she wanted to, as a quiet, polite, stubborn guardian of a nightmare. She proved that you can take away a person's paintings, their money, and their freedom, but you can't force them to change their heart. Her life was a long-form protest against the reality of the 20th century. Watching this story of a life, the takeaway isn't about the gold or the Cranach paintings. It's about the terrifying power of family loyalty. Edda Göring's story shows us that the human capacity for love can be just as dangerous as the capacity for hate. She loved a man who helped set the world on fire, and she spent her life trying to protect the embers. She was a woman who was done by history, but she was also a woman who refused to let history have the final word on her own father. As we close the book on the life of Edda Göring, we're left with the image of that modest Munich apartment, a place filled with ghosts, stolen memories, and the heavy silence of a woman who chose to live in the past because the present was too loud with the truth. She wasn't just a survivor of the war. She was a casualty of it, one who just happened to keep breathing for 8 decades after the shooting stopped. She was the ultimate radioactive orphan. a woman whose very existence was a reminder of a wound that refuses to fully heal. The princess is gone now, buried in a spot that no one can find, in a city that has finally, mostly, moved on. But her story remains a chilling reminder that the shadows of the Third Reich didn't disappear in 1945. They just moved into small apartments, took 9-to-5 jobs, and waited for the end, clutching their secrets like a stolen masterpiece. Edda Göring's life was the ultimate psychological standoff. She lived as a ghost in a world that had moved on, refusing to trade her papa for the historical truth. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that the wounds of history don't always heal. Sometimes they just go into hiding in a modest apartment. If you found this deep dive into the Reich's first daughter riveting, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories from the shadows of history. Leave your comments below so we can hear from you too. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey into the past.